From a circus actress who became Empress of Byzantium to a flamenco dancer crowned Maharani in India, this is a calm yet surprising journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 2 hours. We'll begin with how a bear, keeper's daughter, rewrote imperial law and move deeper into why an Irish-Spanish dancer's whip toppled a Bavarian king. So, put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. The actress, Empress. Constantinople sleeps fitfully tonight, as it always has, caught between the dying embers of Rome and the not-yet-born dreams of something new. The year is somewhere around 520, and if you listen carefully through the narrow streets that wind down from the Great Palace, you can hear the distant roar from the Hippodrome, blues versus greens, as always, their rivalry echoing off marble walls like thunder trapped in a jar. Candles flicker in windows, where senators' wives whisper scandals over wine, their shadows dancing against tapestries that cost more than most people will see in a lifetime. But tonight, we're not interested in the senators' wives. Tonight, we're following a different shadow, one that belongs to a girl who shouldn't exist in polite society at all. Her name is Theodora, and she's about to rewrite the rules of what an empress can be. Picture, if you will, a childhood that reads like something from a fever dream. Theodora's father keeps bears for the circus, not the cuddly sort you might imagine, but the kind that can remove a man's arm with casual efficiency. When he dies, the family slides into poverty like a stone through black water. Her mother, desperate and practical, does what desperate mothers do. She puts her daughters on the stage. In 6th century Constantinople, this is roughly equivalent to tattooing "scandalous" across their foreheads in letters visible from the moon. The circus isn't just entertainment here. It's a whole ecosystem of dubious morality. Theodora learns to dance, to act, to make audiences laugh until their sides ache. She's good at it, unnaturally so, with a presence that seems to bend light around her. But the stage is just the beginning. When you're born at the bottom of society's ladder, you climb using whatever rungs present themselves, and sometimes those rungs are found in brothels, where silk curtains hide transactions that would make proper citizens blush. This is where our story might end, in the usual way such stories do, with a brief, bright life extinguished by poverty or disease or simple grinding desperation. But Theodora has something that can't be bought or sold, a mind like a steel trap wrapped in velvet, and a will that could probably stare down one of her father's bears. Enter Justinian, heir to the throne, and, by all accounts, the sort of man who thinks deeply about administrative reform when other men his age are thinking about wine and horses. He's not particularly handsome. Contemporary accounts suggest he looked rather like a moderately prosperous accountant, but he has that dangerous quality of actually listening when people speak. When he meets Theodora, something happens that the historians struggle to explain in their careful, measured prose. They fall in love, which is either the most natural thing in the world or the most impossible, depending on your perspective. The problem, of course, is that law forbids senators from marrying actresses. It's written right there, in black and white, clear as starlight on snow. Actresses are infames. The infamous ones, legally speaking. They can't testify in court, they can't marry up, they can't even hope to scrub the stain of their profession from their children's children. But Justinian is nothing, if not thorough. If the law says he can't marry Theodora, then obviously the law needs to change. So he changes it, just like that. With the stroke of a pen, he rewrites the entire legal framework governing marriage and social mobility. It's the sort of thing that would make modern politicians weep with envy. Imagine being able to simply delete the inconvenient parts of the law because they interfere with your personal happiness. Their wedding is a quiet affair, private as candlelight in a closed room. No fanfare, no public celebration, just two people who've decided that love matters more than propriety. The court reacts about as well as you'd expect. Empress Euphemia, Justinian's aunt, is reportedly so furious she can barely speak coherent sentences. She refers to Theodora as that creature and predicts the downfall of the empire with the sort of theatrical despair usually reserved for Greek tragedies. But Justinian holds steady. When the criticism reaches a crescendo, when the whispers threaten to become roars, he simply doesn't care. He's found something worth more than approval, and he's willing to weather any storm to keep it. When Justinian becomes emperor, Theodora becomes empress, and this is where the real story begins. Because whatever you might think about her past, Theodora understands power in ways that would make Machiavelli take notes. She doesn't just sit quietly in the palace, embroidering and smiling. She becomes a force of nature, a political earthquake in silk and jewels. The Nika riot of 532 nearly destroys everything. The blues and greens, those circus factions we heard roaring in the distance, unite for once in their shared hatred of the imperial couple. The city erupts in violence, buildings burn, and for a moment it looks like the end of everything Justinian has built. The emperor's advisors counsel flight. Pack up the crown jewels and run for the hills while there's still time. But Theodora stands up in the council chamber, and what she says next becomes legend. She speaks of purple being a noble shroud, of preferring death to exile, of the throne being worth any price. Her voice cuts through the panic like a blade through silk. She will not run. She will not hide. If the empire falls, she will fall with it, wearing the purple. It's the speech that saves the empire. Justinian finds his courage again. The riots are suppressed, and Constantinople settles back into its uneasy peace. But everyone remembers the moment when an actress turned empress showed more backbone than all the blue-blooded nobles combined. Theodora uses her power like a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, purposefully, with an eye toward healing rather than harm. She champions laws protecting women, reforms that give wives more rights in marriage, that offer protection to actresses and prostitutes from the sort of exploitation she knew intimately. She establishes refuges for women fleeing abuse, creates legal pathways for those trapped in lives they never chose. The old guard grumbles, of course. They always do. But change happens anyway, quiet as snow falling on marble, inexorable as sunrise. Years pass. The empire prospers. Justinian and Theodora grow old together, their love deepening into something that needs no words, no grand gestures, just the simple pleasure of shared understanding. When Theodora dies in 548, Justinian is reportedly inconsolable. He never remarries, never even considers it. Some loves, it seems, are too complete to allow for repetition. But their story doesn't end with death. In Ravenna, on the walls of San Vitale, their faces still glow in mosaic splendor. Theodora stands eternal, crowned and imperious, her dark eyes holding secrets that would make angels blush. Even in death, she seems to be evaluating the viewer, deciding whether they're worthy of her attention. The mosaics were commissioned during their lifetime, but they feel like prophecy now. Two people who loved so completely that they transcended the usual boundaries of mortality, becoming something larger than life, more permanent than flesh and blood. When the sun sets just right through the church windows, when the light catches the gold and lapis lazuli, just so, they seem to breathe still, to share some private joke about the persistence of love in an impermanent world. Far to the north, in lands where snow falls like prayers and the winters stretch longer than memory, another unlikely queen was learning to serve ale in a tavern that smelled of wood smoke and possibility. She had no idea that her story would echo across centuries, that her name would become synonymous with the power of love to transform not just hearts, but entire kingdoms. But that's a story for another night, another chapter in the long book of hearts that refused to know their place. The Barmaid Queen. Stockholm in winter wears its cold like a crown, dignified and unyielding. The year is 1565, and the city's market square crunches underfoot with snow that sounds like breaking glass. Merchants huddle around braziers, their breath forming clouds that dissipate into air so crisp it seems to ring like a bell when you breathe it. The sun, when it bothers to appear at all, hangs low and pale as a pearl lost in pewter sky. In one of the modest inns that cluster around the square like sparrows around breadcrumbs, a young woman named Karin Monsdotter moves between tables with the sort of grace that suggests she's dancing to music only she can hear. Her voice, when she sings the old lullabies while she works, has the quality of honey poured over snow, sweet, unexpected, and somehow capable of making the entire room fall silent just to listen. She's the daughter of a soldier, which in 16th century Sweden means she's nobody special, nobody worth noticing. Her hands are red from cold and rough from work. Her dress is practical wool dyed in forgettable brown, and her future stretches ahead like a well-worn path. Marriage to some suitable man, children, a lifetime of serving ale and mending clothes, and pretending that dreams are luxuries she can't afford. But futures, as we're learning, have a way of surprising even the most careful planners. Erik XIV, King of Sweden, is not what you'd call a conventional monarch. Where other kings hunt deer and wage wars and concern themselves with the proper management of kingdoms, Erik spends his time composing music, writing poetry, and generally behaving like someone who'd rather be running a Renaissance salon than a Nordic realm. He's brilliant, certainly, but brilliant in the way that sharp knives are brilliant, likely to cut anyone who handles them carelessly, including himself. When he wanders into Karin's tavern on a winter evening, bundled in furs and looking more like a prosperous merchant than a king, it's not because he's seeking entertainment. Erik is fleeing, though he'd probably call it something more dignified. The weight of the crown sits heavy on his shoulders. The constant pressure of court politics makes his head ache, and sometimes a man needs to sit somewhere warm and anonymous, to drink ale that tastes like it was brewed by human hands rather than royal decree. Karin serves him without ceremony, without the elaborate bowing and scraping that usually accompanies royal appearances. She doesn't recognize him. Why would she? And treats him with the same gentle courtesy she offers every customer. For Erik, who has spent his entire life surrounded by people who calculate the political implications of every smile, this simple honesty is more intoxicating than wine. They begin to talk, tentatively at first. Then, with growing ease, Erik discovers that Karin has opinions about things, about the songs she sings, about the stories she's heard, about the way snow falls differently depending on the wind. She's not educated in the formal sense, can't read Latin or discuss theology, but she has something rarer, a mind that works in leaps and connections, that sees patterns where others see chaos. For Karin, this strange man with his gentle manner and his oddly formal way of speaking becomes a regular fixture at her table. He comes in the evenings, always alone, always courteous, always ready to listen to whatever she has to say. He tells her he's in trade, which isn't entirely a lie. Isn't kingship a kind of trade after all? And she accepts this explanation because she has no reason not to. The revelation, when it comes, is like lightning striking in reverse. Instead of darkness followed by brightness, it's the sudden understanding that the brightness was always there, waiting to be recognized. Erik tells her who he is, on a night when the snow falls so thick it muffles sound, when the tavern feels like the only warm place in a crystalline world. Karin sets down the mug she's been wiping, looks at him for a long moment, and then asks if he'd like another ale. It's exactly the right response, perfectly Karin, in its refusal to be impressed by titles. Erik realizes in that moment that he's been looking for someone who could see him rather than his crown, and he's found her in the most unlikely place imaginable. Their courtship unfolds like a story from the old sagas, full of secrecy and stolen moments. Eric visits the tavern whenever he can escape court, and Karin gradually becomes his refuge from the endless demands of monarchy. She learns to read the tension in his shoulders, to know when he needs silence and when he needs conversation, to offer the kind of comfort that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with simple human understanding. The secret marriage happens in a ceremony so private it might have been a dream, conducted by a priest who's sworn to secrecy in a chapel where the only witnesses are shadows and candlelight. Eric slips a ring onto Karin's finger and promises to love her regardless of what the world might say, and for a moment, it seems like love might actually be enough. But secrets, like snow, have a way of accumulating until their weight becomes impossible to ignore. When the court discovers that their king has married a commoner, not just any commoner, but a tavern girl whose father sold vegetables at market, the reaction is seismic. The nobles who barely tolerated Eric's artistic pretensions now see clear evidence of his unfitness to rule. A king who would marry beneath his station is a king who doesn't understand the basic principles of monarchy. The second public wedding takes place in Stockholm, Stockholm's cathedral, with all the ceremony befitting a royal occasion. Karin, transformed by silk and jewels into something approaching conventional queenliness, walks down the aisle while nobles watch in stony silence. The service proceeds with icy correctness, every word pronounced with the precision of men performing a duty they despise. When the priest calls for the traditional bowing to the new queen, the silence stretches like a held breath. One by one, the nobles remain upright, their backs straight as swords, their faces carved from winter itself. It's a moment of such naked defiance that it seems to freeze the very air in the cathedral. Karin stands there, crowned and radiant, and utterly alone, while the entire Swedish nobility demonstrates their opinion of her elevation. Eric's rage is legendary. He threatens, he cajoles, he issues ultimatums that fall on deaf ears, but the damage is done. The monarchy that survives on the consent of the governed has lost that consent, and no amount of royal fury can restore it. The court intrigues that follow read like a particularly dark fairy tale. Eric's mental state, always fragile, begins to deteriorate under the pressure. He sees conspiracies everywhere, trusts no one, makes decisions that seem designed to alienate what few allies he has left. Karin, caught in the center of this maelstrom, displays a kind of quiet courage that would be admirable in any century. She doesn't try to influence policy or manipulate politics. She simply stands by her husband as he spirals into madness, offering whatever comfort she can. The end comes in 1568, swift and inevitable as an avalanche. Eric is deposed by his own brothers, imprisoned in a castle that becomes his tomb. Karin, pregnant with their son, is taken into a captivity that will last for years. She could have raged, could have demanded recognition of her royal status, could have made the sort of dramatic speeches that historians love to quote. Instead, she accepts her fate with the same grace she once showed while serving ale, understanding that some battles can't be won through fighting. During her long imprisonment, Karin becomes something unexpected, a symbol of dignity in defeat. She raises her children, Eric's children, heirs to a crown they'll never wear, with quiet pride. She teaches them to read, to sing, to find beauty in small things. When visitors come to the prison, they often comment on the strange serenity of the woman who was briefly Queen of Sweden, the way she seems to carry some internal light that no amount of darkness can extinguish. The folk tales that grow up around her tell a different story than the official histories. In the villages where she's remembered, Karin becomes the queen who asked for nothing but peace, who wanted only to love and be loved in return. The stories paint her as a figure of gentle tragedy, someone who stumbled into greatness and handled it with more grace than those born to it. When she's finally released, years later, Karin disappears into the quiet obscurity she perhaps always preferred. Some say she returned to Stockholm, to a small house near the market where she once worked. Others claim she moved to the countryside, where she could watch the seasons change without the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. But the real legacy of Karin Monsdotter isn't in the historical records or the folk tales. It's in the quiet revolution of the heart, the idea that love doesn't require permission from kings or nobles or anyone else. She proved that grace under pressure isn't the exclusive property of the highborn, that dignity can flourish in the most unlikely soil. Her story whispers through the centuries like wind through pine trees, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remain yourself, regardless of the costume circumstances force you to wear. In a world that often confuses volume with importance, spectacle with substance, Karin Monsdotter chose quiet strength over dramatic gesture, and in doing so, she achieved a kind of immortality that no crown could have granted. Across the vast expanses of Asia, in lands where the heat shimmers like dreams and the Mughal court glitters with the accumulated wealth of empires, another woman was about to discover that love can be the most dangerous game of all, where the stakes are nothing less than the transformation of an entire civilization. The Dancing Empress, Delhi in 1,712 shimmers like a mirage made manifest, all marble and gold, and the sort of heat that makes the air itself seem to dance. The red fort rises from the Yamuna's banks like something dreamed by jinn, its walls the color of dried blood, its gardens cool with the sound of fountains that have been singing the same liquid songs for generations. In the feasting halls, Shehnai music drifts through air heavy with rosewater and ambition, while courtiers in silk so fine it seems woven from captured moonlight bow and scheme, and calculate the precise angle of their deference. Jahandar Shah has just been crowned emperor, and the entire Mughal world holds its breath to see what sort of ruler this unlikely man will prove to be. He's not young, past 50, with the soft belly of someone who's spent more time contemplating poetry than practicing swordplay. But he carries himself with the sort of dignity that comes from understanding that power is a performance, and every performance requires absolute commitment to the role. The coronation festivities stretch on for weeks, each day bringing new entertainments, new displays of wealth that would make Croesus weep with envy. Musicians compete for the emperor's attention. Poets recite verses that compare his reign to golden ages that may or may not have existed, and dancers perform with the sort of grace that makes gravity seem like a polite suggestion rather than a law of physics. It's during one of these performances that Jahandar Shah first sees Lal Kunwar, and the moment reshapes the trajectory of an empire without anyone realizing it's happening. She moves like music given form, her gungrus keeping time with rhythms that seem to emerge from the very stones of the palace. Her dance tells stories of lovers separated by fate, of gods who descend to earth for a single perfect moment, of hearts that beat in synchrony across impossible distances. But it's not just her dancing that captures the emperor's attention. Lal Kunwar has eyes that hold depths like still water, a smile that suggests she knows secrets worth keeping, and a way of moving through the world that makes everything around her seem more vivid, more real, more worth paying attention to. She's a tawaif, which is to say she's part of a tradition that Delhi's more conventional citizens prefer to acknowledge with sideways glances and whispered conversations. The tawaif salons are worlds unto themselves, places where art and culture flourish under the patronage of men who understand that beauty is worth paying for, that some pleasures can't be purchased with gold, but must be earned through appreciation, through the ability to recognize excellence when it appears. Lal Kunwar rules over one such salon, a place where poets come to test their verses, where musicians learn to make their instruments weep, where conversation flows like wine and is just as intoxicating. When Jahandar Shah begins visiting her salon, it's ostensibly to hear the music, to enjoy the sort of refined entertainment that befits an emperor's leisure hours. But anyone watching would notice that his attention focuses like sunlight through a lens, that he seems to see only her, even when the room is full of other performers. Their conversations, conducted in the formal Urdu that turns every sentence into a small poem, dance around the edge of something that neither quite dares to name. The courtship unfolds like a particularly intricate piece of music, full of themes and variations, of melodies that seem to approach resolution only to spiral away into new complexities. Jahandar Shah finds reasons to extend his visits, to request particular songs, to engage Lal Kunwar in discussions about poetry and philosophy, and the sort of abstract questions that allow two people to reveal themselves without seeming to do so deliberately. For her part, Lal Kunwar navigates this attention with the skill of someone who's learned to read the subtle currents of power and desire. She's not naive. Women in her position can't afford to be. But there's something in the emperor's manner that suggests genuine feeling, rather than mere imperial whim. When he looks at her, she sees not the calculation of a man acquiring a beautiful object, but the wonder of someone who's stumbled onto something unexpected and precious. The moonlit boat rides on the Yamuna become legendary, though few people witness them directly. The emperor's barge glides across water that reflects stars like scattered diamonds, while musicians play softly from the stern, and Lal Kunwar's voice weaves through the night air like incense made audible. They speak of everything and nothing, of the way moonlight changes the color of water, of the poems that describe love as a form of divine madness, of the curious fact that happiness so often arrives disguised as something else entirely. It's during one of these river journeys that Jahandar Shah asks her to marry him, the words floating across the water with the sort of casual inevitability that makes the impossible seem perfectly natural. Lal Kunwar's response comes not in words but in the way she allows her fingers to trail in the water, creating ripples that catch the light and scatter it into 1,000 tiny moons. The wedding, when it happens, is a hasty affair that sends shockwaves through the Mughal court like earthquake tremors. Jahandar Shah doesn't ask permission from his advisors, doesn't consult with the religious authorities, doesn't even announce his intentions until the ceremony is already underway. He simply declares that he will marry the woman he loves, and anyone who objects can discuss the matter with the imperial guard. Lal Kunwar becomes Imtiaz Mahal, the Palace of Excellence, a title that reflects both her new status and the emperor's opinion of her worth. The court reacts with the sort of barely contained horror usually reserved for natural disasters or declarations of war. A wife as empress? It's unprecedented, unthinkable, the sort of thing that threatens the very foundations of social order. The conservative elements of the court organize their opposition with the efficiency of a military campaign. They whisper about the degradation of the monarchy, about the need to protect Islamic values from the corrupting influence of dancing girls, about the precedent this sets for future generations. Some of the more dramatic among them threaten public floggings, both for the emperor's defiance of propriety and for the empress's presumption in accepting elevation so far above her station. But Jahandar Shah, for all his reputation as a dreamer and a poet, possesses a streak of stubbornness that would make a mule seem flexible. He's found something worth having, and he's not about to let social conventions or religious objections or political calculations deprive him of it. When the criticism reaches a crescendo, he responds by showering Imtiaz Mahal with even more honors, creating new titles for her, commissioning portraits that will hang in the palace for generations. The extravagance that follows reads like a catalogue of imperial excess. Jahandar Shah, intoxicated by love and power in equal measure, begins spending money like a man who's discovered that tomorrow has been cancelled. Festivals that last for months, gifts that could fund small armies, building projects that seem designed more to impress his empress than to serve any practical purpose. The imperial treasury, already strained by decades of warfare and expansion, begins to hemorrhage gold like a wounded giant. The revenue farming system, that complex network of taxation, and tribute that keeps the empire functioning, starts to collapse under the weight of imperial extravagance. Local governors, seeing the chaos at the center, begin to question whether their loyalty is worth maintaining. Provincial rebellions break out like fires on a dry plain, each one requiring expensive military expeditions to suppress. Imtiaz Mahal, caught in the center of this maelstrom, displays a kind of quiet wisdom that seems to come from understanding that she's become a symbol for forces much larger than herself. She tries to moderate her husband's excesses, to counsel restraint, to remind him that love doesn't require bankrupting an empire to prove its worth. But Jahandar Shah, perhaps sensing that his time is running out, seems determined to compress a lifetime of devotion into whatever span remains to him. The end comes in 1713. Swift and brutal as a sword stroke, Farrukhsiyar, backed by the powerful Sayyid brothers, defeats Jahandar Shah in battle and claims the throne for himself. The emperor who loved too much dies as emperors often do, violently, suddenly, with all his grand plans reduced to footnotes in someone else's history. Imtiaz Mahal's fate becomes one of those historical mysteries that tantalize scholars and poets alike. Some sources suggest she died with her husband, choosing loyalty over survival. Others claim she disappeared into the anonymous crowds of Delhi, returning to the shadows from which she'd emerged. The truth, as is often the case with women whose lives intersect with power, remains elusive. But the folklore that grows up around her tells a different story, one that focuses not on the political disaster of Jahandar Shah's reign, but on the quiet reforms that Imtiaz Mahal championed during her brief time as empress. The stories credit her with softening the tax burden on widows, with establishing funds for the care of orphaned children, with using her influence to protect the women who worked in the tawaf salons from the worst excesses of their patrons. Whether these tales are historically accurate matters less than what they reveal about the kind of legacy Imtiaz Mahal created. In the collective memory of Delhi's common people, she becomes not the dancing girl who destroyed an empire, but the empress who remembered where she came from and tried to use her power to help others climb the same ladder she'd ascended. Her story whispers through the centuries like evening ragas, a reminder that love and power make dangerous companions, that the heart's desires and the state's needs don't always align, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't make it into the official histories. In a world where women's lives are often measured by their utility to men, Imtiaz Mahal carved out a space for herself that was entirely her own, and in doing so, she achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of imperial gold could have purchased. Beyond the Indus, in lands where the rivers run with the melted snow of the Himalayas and the air rings with the sound of temple bells and the clash of sabers, another story was beginning to unfold. A Sikh Maharaja was about to discover that sometimes the greatest courage isn't found on the battlefield, but in the willingness to risk everything for love, even when that love comes wrapped in scandal and sacred censure. The NAUTCH girl of Lahore. Lahore in 1802 breathes with the rhythm of a city that has seen empires rise and fall like seasons, each one leaving its mark in the stonework and the songs that echo through narrow streets at twilight. The Shalimar Gardens still whisper with the ghosts of Mughal poetry, their fountains catching the last light of day and throwing it back in crystalline arcs that seem to suspend time itself. In the Maharaja's Durbar, silk drapes in colors that would make peacocks weep with envy, and the air itself seems rich enough to taste, heavy with rosewater and ambition, with the sort of possibility that comes when power is young and the world feels malleable. Ranjit Singh sits on his throne like a man who's still slightly surprised to find himself there, though he's been Maharaja of the Punjab for 3 years now. At 22, he's already proven himself in battle, carved out an empire from the chaos that followed the Mughal collapse, and earned the sort of reputation that makes enemies think twice before crossing his borders. But tonight, with the business of statecraft temporarily set aside, He's content to listen to music and watch the dancers whose art transforms the Durbar into something approaching paradise. The performance tonight is something special. Everyone agrees. The musicians have been rehearsing for weeks, their tabla and sitar weaving together in patterns that seem to pull melodies from the very air. But it's the dancer who commands attention, who makes the room fall silent with the sort of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. Her name is Moran, and she moves like prayer made visible, her gungrus marking time with rhythms that seem to emerge from the heartbeat of the earth itself. When she sings, her voice carries the weight of centuries, ghazals that speak of love as both blessing and curse, of beauty that wounds and heals in the same moment, of the curious fact that the most profound truths often come wrapped in the simplest words. Her repertoire includes Persian poetry that would make scholars weep, Punjabi folk songs that connect her to the soil of the land she's performing in, and improvisations that seem to spin themselves from the very air of the moment. Ranjit Singh has heard 1,000 performances, has been entertained by artists from across his kingdom and beyond. But there's something about Moran that bypasses the usual channels of aesthetic appreciation and speaks directly to something deeper, something that has nothing to do with his position as Maharaja and everything to do with the man beneath the crown. When she performs, he doesn't see a Nautch girl displaying her skills for royal approval. He sees a woman who carries music in her bones, who understands that art is the closest thing to magic that mortals are permitted to practice. The courtship that follows unfolds like a particularly complex raga, full of variations and improvisations that seem to spiral around a central theme, without ever quite resolving it. Ranjit Singh finds reasons to extend the evening's entertainment, to request particular songs, to engage Moran in conversations about poetry and music, and the sort of abstract questions that allow two people to reveal themselves without seeming to do so deliberately. For her part, Moran navigates this attention with the skill of someone who's learned to read the subtle currents of power and desire. She's not naive about the realities of her position. Women in her profession survive by understanding the difference between genuine feeling and mere imperial caprice. But there's something in the Maharaja's manner that suggests depth rather than shallow infatuation, a quality of attention that makes her feel seen rather than merely observed. Their relationship develops in the spaces between formal occasions, in the quiet moments when the Durbar empties and the musicians pack away their instruments. Ranjit Singh speaks to her about the weight of ruling, about the loneliness that comes with making decisions that affect thousands of lives, about the curious fact that absolute power often feels like absolute isolation. Moran listens with the sort of understanding that comes from her own experience of living on the margins, of being simultaneously essential and expendable, valued and vulnerable. When he asks her to marry him, the words come not during some grand romantic gesture, but during one of these quiet conversations, spoken with the sort of casual inevitability that makes the impossible seem perfectly natural. Moran's response comes not in words, but in the way she allows her hand to rest briefly on his, a touch that speaks of trust and tenderness, and the courage required to say yes to something that will inevitably change everything. The wedding takes place in a village gurdwara, small and intimate, and deliberately removed from the pageantry of the royal court. Ranjit Singh arrives not in imperial procession but quietly, almost secretly, as if he's afraid that too much attention might break the spell that's brought him to this moment. The ceremony follows Sikh traditions, with the couple walking around the Guru Granth Sahib, while the wedding hymns speak of souls joining in eternal partnership. But if Ranjit Singh hopes to keep his marriage quiet, he's forgotten that news travels faster than horses when it carries the weight of scandal. Within days, the story has spread throughout the Punjab and beyond. The Sikh Maharaja has married a Nautch girl, has elevated a dancing woman to royal status, has chosen love over political alliance in a way that threatens the very foundations of dynastic marriage. The reaction is swift and devastating. Akali Phula Singh, the fierce religious leader whose blessing Ranjit Singh needs to maintain his legitimacy among the Sikh faithful, responds with the sort of dramatic gesture that becomes legend. He publicly flogs the Maharaja, actually strikes him with a whip, in full view of the court, each lash a rebuke for the transgression of marrying beneath his station, for allowing personal desire to override religious and social propriety. The scene plays out like something from a medieval morality play, with the Maharaja submitting to punishment rather than defending his choice through force. It's a moment of such naked humiliation that it seems to freeze the very air in the Durbar, yet Ranjit Singh endures it with the sort of stoic dignity that transforms punishment into a kind of victory. He will not renounce his marriage, will not abandon the woman he loves, will not pretend that his heart is subject to the same political calculations that govern his kingdom. The aftermath of this public censure reveals the true extent of Moran's influence, though she wields it with the sort of subtlety that makes her impact difficult to measure in conventional terms. She becomes not just the Maharaja's wife, but his unofficial advisor, the person whose opinion he seeks when the weight of decisions becomes too much to bear alone. Her background gives her insights into the lives of common people that court officials, for all their education and experience, simply cannot provide. The architectural patronage that follows speaks to Moran's understanding of art as something more than mere decoration. She influences the design of new buildings, the commissioning of paintings, the sort of cultural investments that transform a kingdom from a mere political entity into something approaching a civilization. Her taste runs toward the subtle rather than the spectacular, toward beauty that reveals itself gradually rather than overwhelming the viewer at first glance. The postal reforms that benefit dancers' families carry her signature as well, though she's careful never to claim credit openly. New regulations that provide some protection for performing artists, that establish funds for the care of orphan children, that create legal pathways for women to escape abusive situations. These changes happen quietly, without fanfare, as if they're the natural evolution of a more just society rather than the result of deliberate policy choices. But power, as Moran learns, is a double-edged sword that cuts both ways. The constant pressure of court life, the need to navigate between competing factions, the exhausting work of maintaining influence without appearing to grasp for it, all of this takes its toll. When political circumstances force her exile to Pathankot, she accepts the banishment with the same grace she once showed while performing, understanding that some battles can't be won through direct confrontation. The letters she writes during her exile, preserved in faded Gurmukhi script, reveal a woman who's learned to find meaning in loss, who understands that love doesn't always manifest as triumph, but sometimes as the willingness to sacrifice for another's greater good. She writes about the mountains visible from her window, about the changing seasons that mark the passage of time, about the curious fact that happiness often arrives disguised as something else entirely. The correspondence between Moran and Ranjit Singh during this period reads like a masterclass in the art of loving across distance. They write about politics and poetry, about the daily details of their separate lives, about the memories they share and the dreams they still hold in common. The letters reveal a relationship that has deepened beyond the initial attraction, that has become something more complex and durable than mere romance. When Moran dies in 1838, still in exile but maintained in comfort by the Maharaja's continued devotion, she leaves behind a legacy that's difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The cultural flowering that characterized Ranjit Singh's reign owes much to her influence, though the historians who document these achievements rarely mention her name. The social reforms that improved the lives of women and artists throughout the Punjab carry her fingerprints, though she was careful never to claim credit for them openly. Her story whispers through the centuries like evening prayers, a reminder that love and power can coexist, that the heart's desires and the state's needs don't always conflict. and that sometimes the most lasting victories are the ones that don't make it into the official histories. In a world where women's lives are often measured by their utility to men, Moran carved out a space for herself that was entirely her own, and in doing so, she achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of royal gold could have purchased. The legend of Moran Sarkar, for that's how she's remembered in the folk songs that still echo through Punjabi villages, speaks not of the NAUTCH girl who corrupted a king, but of the woman who proved that love can be the most powerful force in the world, strong enough to bend even empires to its will, gentle enough to transform hearts without breaking them. Beyond the Himalayan passes, in lands where the rivers run with the melted snow of distant peaks, and the air rings with the sound of orthodox bells and the clash of sabers, another story was beginning to unfold. A Russian Tsar was about to discover that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in palaces but in the humblest circumstances, that love can bloom even in the frozen battlefields where empires are won and lost. The soldier's laundry girl, TSARINA. The Baltic coast in winter is a study in absolutes. White snow against black water, the kind of cold that makes your breath crystallize before it leaves your lips. Silence. So complete, it seems to ring in your ears like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. The year is 1703, and Peter the Great's army has been laying siege to Swedish fortresses for months now. Each day, a grinding repetition of cannon fire and shouted orders, and the sort of endurance that separates soldiers from civilians. In the camp that sprawls behind the siege lines like a temporary city, 10,000 men try to maintain the fiction that they're still civilized human beings, rather than instruments of imperial ambition. Tents cluster around cooking fires that throw wild shadows against the snow, while supply wagons creak through mud that's frozen solid enough to walk on. The air smells of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of weapons that never quite get clean, no matter how much oil you rub into the steel. It's here, in this unlikely setting, that we find a young woman named Marta, scrubbing uniforms in water so cold it makes her hands ache like broken bones. She's an orphan from somewhere in Livonia. The exact details have been lost to the sort of historical carelessness that befalls people whose lives are deemed unworthy of careful record-keeping. What we know is this. She's perhaps 17. She speaks a mixture of languages that reflects the Baltic's complicated ethnic geography, and she has the sort of practical competence that keeps armies functioning when the grand strategies fail. Marta works by moonlight when she can, the better to avoid the attention that comes with being one of the few women in a camp full of men, whose connection to civilized behavior grows more tenuous with each passing day. Her hands move with the efficiency of someone who's learned that survival depends on making yourself useful, on finding ways to be essential rather than merely tolerated. The uniforms she washes come back cleaner than they have any right to be, considering the circumstances, and the soldiers who employ her services speak of her with the sort of grudging respect, usually reserved for particularly effective weapons. It's during one of these midnight laundry sessions that she first encounters Peter himself, though she doesn't recognize him initially. He's just another tall man in a military coat, wandering the camp with the restless energy of someone who can't sleep, who finds the business of waiting more exhausting than the actual fighting. When he stops at her washing station, she assumes he's another officer come to check on her work, and she continues scrubbing without looking up. Peter, for his part, is intrigued by this scene of quiet industry, by the way this young woman manages to maintain some semblance of domestic order in the midst of military chaos. He's spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who defer to his every whim, who calculate the political implications of every conversation, who see him as Tsar first and human being a distant second. Here's someone who treats him with the same matter-of-fact courtesy she'd show any customer, and for a man who's grown weary of ceremonial distance, this ordinary interaction feels like a revelation. They begin to talk, tentatively at first. Then, with growing ease, Peter discovers that Marta has opinions about things about the way different fabrics respond to different cleaning methods, about the stories she's heard from the soldiers whose uniforms she tends, about the curious fact that war seems to bring out both the worst and best in human nature. She's not educated in the formal sense, can't read or write in any of the languages she speaks, but she has something rarer, a mind that works in connections, that sees patterns where others see only chaos. For Marta, this strange man with his intense eyes and his oddly formal way of speaking becomes a regular fixture at her washing station. He comes in the evenings, always alone, always ready to listen to whatever she has to say. He tells her he works for the Tsar, which isn't entirely a lie, and she accepts this explanation because she has no reason to question it. Their conversations range from the practical, how to get bloodstains out of linen, to the philosophical, as Peter finds himself discussing his dreams for Russia with someone who has no political agenda, no hidden motives, no reason to tell him anything other than what she actually thinks. The revelation of his identity comes gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew. Marta pieces together the clues, the way guards defer to him, the quality of his coat, the fact that he seems to know things about the war that ordinary soldiers wouldn't know. When understanding finally dawns, she sets down the uniform she's been washing, looks at him for a long moment, and asks if he'd like her to clean his coat as well. It's exactly the right response, perfectly Marta, in its refusal to be impressed by titles. Peter realizes in that moment that he's been looking for someone who could see him rather than his crown, and he's found her in the most unlikely place imaginable, not in some glittering court but in a military camp, not among the educated nobility, but in the person of an orphaned laundry girl who treats emperors and common soldiers with the same straightforward dignity. Their relationship deepens through conversations held by firelight, through shared meals of army rations that somehow taste better when eaten in good company, through the sort of quiet intimacy that develops when two people discover they can be themselves with each other. Peter talks about his vision for Russia, the ports he wants to build, the technologies he wants to import, the ways he hopes to drag his country into the modern world, whether it wants to come or not. Marta listens with the sort of attention that comes from genuine interest rather than political necessity, asking questions that reveal the practical wisdom of someone who understands how grand plans actually affect ordinary people. When she becomes pregnant with their first child, the news spreads through the camp like wildfire, though Peter makes no official announcement. The soldiers who've grown fond of Marta begin treating her with a kind of protective deference, while officers who understand the political implications start calculating how this development might affect their own positions. But Peter himself seems genuinely delighted, as if fatherhood represents yet another frontier to explore, another challenge to master. The secret children who follow, Anna, Elizabeth, Peter, Paul, grow up in a world suspended between imperial grandeur and domestic simplicity. They learn to read from tutors Peter imports from Western Europe, but they also learn practical skills from their mother, who insists that royal blood doesn't exempt anyone from understanding how the world actually works. The family portrait that emerges from contemporary accounts shows something unprecedented in Russian royal history: genuine affection rather than dynastic calculation, a household where love matters more than protocol. The formal marriage in 1712 takes place in a cathedral ceremony that attempts to balance Peter's personal desires with the political necessities of imperial rule. Marta, now Catherine, stands at the altar wearing silk and jewels that transform her into something approaching conventional queenliness. But those who know her see the same practical competence that once made her the most reliable laundrywoman in the Baltic fleet. The service proceeds with the full pomp of Orthodox tradition, but underneath the ceremony runs a current of genuine emotion that gives weight to vows that might otherwise feel like mere political theatre. The coronation in 1724 represents the culmination of one of the most unlikely love stories in Russian history. Catherine, crowned as empress in her own right, becomes the first woman to achieve such status through merit rather than inheritance. The ceremony unfolds with all the grandeur Peter can devise, but those who know the couple's history understand that the real significance lies not in the political precedent, but in the personal journey, from army camp to cathedral, from orphaned refugee to empress of all the Russias. But perhaps Catherine's most important role comes in the midnight councils that become legendary among those close to the imperial family. When Peter's famous rages threaten to consume his judgment, when the pressures of modernizing an unwilling country drive him to the edge of emotional breakdown, Catherine provides the sort of calm counsel that can only come from someone who has no agenda beyond wanting what's best for the man she loves. She becomes his anchor to sanity, the voice of practical wisdom that keeps his grand dreams tethered to achievable reality. The Senate, that collection of nobles and administrators who help govern Peter's expanding empire, learns to work with Catherine rather than around her. Her background gives her insights into the lives of common people that court officials, for all their education and experience, simply cannot provide. When new policies are being debated, she asks the questions that force everyone to consider how abstract principles will affect actual human beings. The social reforms that follow carry Catherine's signature, though she's careful never to claim credit openly. New regulations that provide some protection for servants and workers, that establish funds for the care of orphaned children, that create legal pathways for women to escape abusive marriages. These changes happen gradually, as if they're the natural evolution of a more just society, rather than the result of deliberate policy choices. When Peter dies in 1725, Catherine's grief is profound but not paralyzing. She understands that the empire he built requires steady leadership, that the reforms he initiated need protection from those who would reverse them given the chance. When she becomes the first woman to rule Russia in her own name, she does so with the same practical competence she once brought to washing soldiers' uniforms, the same clear-eyed understanding of what needs to be done. Her reign, though brief, establishes precedents that will echo through Russian history for centuries. She proves that effective leadership doesn't require noble birth, that wisdom can emerge from the most unlikely backgrounds, that sometimes the best qualification for power is having lived without it long enough to understand its proper use. The legacy Catherine leaves behind reads like a meditation on the transformative power of love, both personal and political. Her story demonstrates that affection and governance can work in harmony, that the skills required to maintain a successful marriage, patience, compromise, the ability to see beyond immediate desires to long-term consequences, are precisely the skills required to maintain a successful empire. When she dies in 1727, just 2 years after taking the throne, Catherine I goes to her grave, having achieved something unprecedented in the history of monarchy. She ruled not because she was born to it, not because she married into it, but because she earned it through demonstrating that character matters more than breeding, that competence trumps conspiracy, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remain yourself while the world tries to transform you into something else. Her story whispers through the centuries like wind through pine forests, a reminder that greatness can emerge from the humblest circumstances, that love can be the foundation for empire rather than its enemy, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen in human hearts rather than on battlefields. Far to the south, in lands where flamenco guitars sing their passionate laments and the Andalusian sun beats down on ancient cobblestones, another unlikely love story was beginning to unfold. A Spanish dancing girl was about to discover that sometimes destiny arrives wearing a turban, speaking a language you don't recognize, and offering a future you never dared to imagine. The flamenco RANI, Madrid in 1906 sparkles like champagne in crystal, all gaslight and silk, and the sort of excited anticipation that comes when a royal wedding promises to transform gossip into history. Alfonso XIII is marrying Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, and the entire city has dressed itself in celebration, flags hanging from every balcony, flowers scattered in the streets like confetti, the kind of collective joy that makes even strangers smile at each other as they pass. In the cafe, concerts that cluster around the Plaza Mayor like moths around a flame, performers compete for the attention of visitors who've come to Madrid for the spectacle. Tonight is their chance to be noticed, to catch the eye of some wealthy patron who might change their fortunes with a casual gesture of approval. The air thrums with guitar music and the clicking of castanets, with voices raised in song and the rhythmic stamping of feet that makes the very building seem to pulse with life. It's here, in this atmosphere of celebration and possibility, that we find Anita Delgado, 17 years old and dancing as if her life depends on it, which, in a very real sense, it does. She moves with the fierce grace that characterizes the best flamenco, her body telling stories of passion and loss and defiance, her feet marking time with rhythms that seem to emerge from the very stones of Andalusia. When she dances, the crowded cafe falls silent, with the sort of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. Anita comes from the sort of background that makes dreams seem like luxuries she can't afford. Her father works in a cafe, her family lives in rooms above a shop, and her future stretches ahead like a well-worn path. Marriage to some suitable man, children, a lifetime of serving customers, and pretending that there's nothing beyond the narrow streets of her neighborhood. But when she dances, none of that matters. When she dances, she becomes something larger than circumstance, something that transcends the usual boundaries of class and expectation. In the audience tonight sits a man who seems slightly out of place among the Spanish revelers, darker-skinned, wearing clothes that suggest wealth but not European wealth, watching the performances with the sort of intense attention that makes the performers themselves take notice. His name is Jagatjit Singh, Maharaja of Kapurthala, and he's in Madrid for the royal wedding, representing the British Raj at this celebration of European monarchy. When Anita begins her performance, something electric passes between them. Not love at first sight, exactly, but recognition of a sort that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to something deeper. She sees in his eyes an appreciation that goes beyond mere aesthetic pleasure, a quality of attention that makes her feel seen rather than simply observed. He sees in her movement a kind of artistry that reminds him of the classical dancers of his own court, a mastery that transcends cultural boundaries and speaks to universal truths about beauty and passion and the human capacity for transcendence. The courtship that follows unfolds like something from a fairy tale, though the reality is more complex than any story told to children. Jagatjit Singh extends his stay in Europe, ostensibly to conduct diplomatic business, but actually to pursue this Spanish dancer who's captured his imagination. He appears at her performances night after night, always alone, always attentive, gradually making himself part of the landscape of her life. For Anita, this exotic prince represents possibilities she's never dared to imagine. He speaks to her of India, of palaces that make European castles seem modest, of gardens where fountains play among flowers she's never heard of a world where art and beauty are valued, not as entertainment, but as expressions of the divine. His courtship is conducted with a mixture of Eastern formality and genuine feeling that she finds both exotic and oddly comforting. The proposal, when it comes, arrives wrapped in practicality as much as romance. Jagatjit Singh offers not just marriage but transformation, passage to a different world, education in languages and customs she's never encountered, the chance to become someone entirely new, while somehow remaining essentially herself. For a young woman whose horizons have been limited by circumstances beyond her control, the offer represents freedom in its most seductive form. But transformation, as Anita quickly learns, requires more than simply saying yes to an attractive proposal. Before she can marry an Indian prince, she must become someone capable of being an Indian princess. Jagatjit Singh arranges for her education at the finest finishing schools Paris has to offer, places where aristocratic young women learn the subtle arts of conversation and deportment, where every gesture is refined until it becomes unconscious grace. The months that follow read like a compressed novel of personal development. Anita learns to speak French and English with the sort of fluency that allows her to navigate European society, to carry herself with the confidence that comes from understanding that beauty and intelligence are more powerful than noble birth. She studies Indian culture and customs, learning to appreciate art forms and philosophical traditions that expand her understanding of what human civilization can achieve. The two ceremonies that solemnize their marriage, Catholic in Paris, Sikh in Kapurthala, represent the complex negotiations required when love crosses not just national, but cultural boundaries. The Catholic ceremony satisfies European sensibilities and provides legal recognition in the Western world, while the Sikh ceremony honors Jagatjit Singh's religious obligations and ensures acceptance by his own people. Anita, now Princess Prem Kaur, navigates both with the sort of diplomatic grace that suggests she's found her true calling. Life in Kapurthala's French-style palace unfolds like a dream made manifest, though dreams, as Anita discovers, can be as isolating as they are beautiful. The palace itself is a marvel of architectural fusion, combining Indian grandeur with European elegance in ways that create something entirely new. Gardens, designed by French landscapers, frame fountains that play among flowers imported from around the world, while rooms decorated in Louis XVI-style house collections of art that span continents and centuries. But beauty, Anita learns, is not the same thing as belonging. The European elegance that surrounds her serves as a constant reminder that she's neither fully Indian nor entirely accepted by the European communities that gather around Indian courts. She occupies a curious middle ground, too exotic for conventional European society, too Western for traditional Indian acceptance. The travel journals she writes by lamplight become her refuge, the place where she can process the overwhelming experience of living between worlds. Her entries reveal a woman grappling with questions of identity and belonging, trying to understand how love can be simultaneously fulfilling and isolating, how privilege can feel like imprisonment when it comes at the cost of everything familiar. The loneliness that gradually creeps into her marriage isn't the result of cruelty or neglect, but of the simple impossibility of truly sharing experiences that don't translate across cultural boundaries. Jagatjit Singh loves her genuinely, provides for her generously, treats her with consistent kindness. But he can't give her what she didn't realize she needed until she lost it. The sense of being understood without explanation, of belonging somewhere without conscious effort. The rumors that eventually surround their marriage say more about the observers than the observed. European visitors to Kapurthala whisper about the Spanish dancer who married above her station, while Indian courtiers speculate about the foreign woman who can never truly understand their ways. But those closest to the couple see something different. Two people who genuinely care for each other, struggling with the practical difficulties of building a life across cultural divides. The separation, when it comes, unfolds with the sort of dignity that suggests both parties understand they're dealing with forces larger than personal failure. There's no dramatic confrontation, no public scandal, just the quiet acknowledgement that some problems can't be solved through good intentions and genuine affection. Anita returns to Europe not as a rejected wife, but as a woman who's discovered that love alone isn't always enough to bridge the gaps between different worlds. But the friendship that survives their marriage speaks to something deeper than romantic failure. They continue to correspond, to care about each other's welfare, to remember with genuine fondness the years when their different worlds seemed to complement rather than compete with each other. Their letters reveal two people who learned something valuable about themselves through loving each other, even if that love couldn't be sustained in the form they originally hoped. The legacy Anita leaves behind defies easy categorization. She becomes neither the cautionary tale about marrying outside one's station, nor the success story about love conquering all obstacles. Instead, she represents something more complex. The courage to pursue extraordinary possibilities, even when they come with extraordinary costs. The willingness to transform oneself for love, while somehow maintaining essential identity. Her story whispers through the centuries like guitar music heard through palace walls, a reminder that some journeys are worth taking even when they don't lead to the destinations we originally imagined. That some forms of wealth can't be measured in gold or comfort or social position, and that sometimes the most important thing we can learn is how to love courageously, even when that courage leads us into territories we never expected to explore. In the palace at COURTESAN, visitors still speak of the Spanish princess who brought flamenco to the Punjab, whose presence somehow made the marble corridors echo with the ghost music of Andalusian guitars, whose story became part of the palace's own legend. The rooms she occupied retain a kind of romantic melancholy, as if the very walls remember what it felt like to shelter a love that was beautiful and impossible in equal measure. The uncrowned Queen of Bavaria. Munich in 1846 wears its autumn like mourning clothes, all grey skies and wet cobblestones that reflect the gaslight in fractured rainbows. The October rain falls steadily, the kind of persistent drizzle that seeps into your bones and makes the whole city feel like it's wrapped in melancholy. In the Royal Theatre, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows against gilded walls, the evening's performance has just concluded to the sort of polite applause that suggests duty rather than enthusiasm. But tonight, the real performance is about to begin in the lobby, where Munich's cultural elite gather to discuss art and politics with the sort of refined conversation that passes for intellectual discourse in royal circles. They cluster around small tables, their voices creating a gentle murmur that mingles with the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk, everyone playing their assigned roles in the elaborate theatre of court life. It's into this scene of cultivated restraint that Lola Montez arrives like a force of nature, her riding whip cracking against her boot with sharp reports that make conversation falter and heads turn. She moves through the crowd with the sort of predatory grace that suggests she's perfectly aware of the effect she's creating, her dark eyes scanning the room with an intelligence that makes men uncomfortable and women suspicious. Lola, though that's not the name she was born with, any more than her exotic backstory, is the biography she actually lived, has spent the last several years perfecting the art of being exactly what people expect her to be, which is to say scandalous, seductive, and slightly dangerous. She's reinvented herself so thoroughly that she sometimes seems to believe her own mythology, a woman who's become the character she created to survive in a world that offers limited options for ambitious females. Ludwig I, King of Bavaria, sits at his usual table in the corner, supposedly discussing the finer points of Greek sculpture with his Minister of Culture, but actually watching this dark-haired woman who's disrupting his carefully ordered evening. At 60, Ludwig has achieved the sort of distinguished respectability that comes with successful reign. But success, he's discovering, isn't the same thing as satisfaction. His marriage is dutiful rather than passionate. His court is efficient rather than inspiring. And his life has settled into the sort of predictable routine that makes each day feel like a repetition of the last. When Lola approaches his table, not summoned, not introduced, simply materializing like a genie released from a lamp, the conversation dies around them, as if someone has drawn a curtain across sound itself. She speaks to him directly, ignoring protocol and precedent with the sort of casual audacity that would be unthinkable from anyone else. Her voice carries a slight accent that might be Spanish or Irish or something else entirely, and her words have the quality of someone who's learned that boldness often succeeds where politeness fails. The conversation that follows becomes the stuff of immediate legend, though the exact details vary, depending on who's telling the story. What everyone agrees on is this: Lola treats the King of Bavaria like a man rather than a monument, speaks to him as if his opinions matter more than his title, and somehow manages to make him remember what it felt like to be surprised by another human being. For Ludwig, this encounter represents something he didn't realize he'd been missing. Here's someone who sees him rather than his crown, who responds to his thoughts rather than his position, who treats conversation as an art form rather than a diplomatic necessity. When she leaves that evening, she takes with her something he can't quite name but knows he wants back. The courtship that follows unfolds like a particularly complex piece of music, full of themes and variations that seem to approach resolution, only to spiral away into new complications. Ludwig finds reasons to invite Lola to court functions, to request her opinion on artistic matters, to engage her in the sort of discussions that allow two people to reveal themselves without seeming to do so deliberately. For her part, Lola navigates this attention with the skill of someone who's learned to read the subtle currents of power and desire. She's not naive about the realities of her position. Women in her circumstances survive by understanding the difference between genuine feeling and mere royal caprice. But there's something in Ludwig's manner that suggests depth rather than shallow infatuation, a quality of attention that makes her feel valued rather than merely desired. The relationship that develops exists in that curious space between romance and politics, where personal feelings and state interests intersect in ways that make both more complicated. Ludwig speaks to her about his vision for Bavaria, about the cultural renaissance he hopes to foster, about the weight of making decisions that affect thousands of lives. Lola listens with the sort of engaged intelligence that comes from genuine interest rather than calculated flattery. When rumors of a potential morganatic marriage begin circulating through Munich's political circles, the reaction is swift and devastating. A morganatic marriage, where the lower-born spouse receives neither royal rank nor succession rights, represents a compromise between heart and duty, but Ludwig's ministers see it as a catastrophic breach of royal protocol. The very idea threatens the careful balance of power that keeps Bavaria stable, the delicate network of alliances that makes the kingdom viable. The opposition organizes itself with military efficiency. Conservative ministers threaten resignation. Religious leaders speak darkly about the moral implications of royal scandal, and foreign diplomats begin calculating how this development might affect their own nation's relationships with Bavaria. The pressure builds like steam in a closed vessel, threatening explosion if not carefully managed. But Ludwig, for all his reputation as a cultured aesthete, possesses a streak of romantic stubbornness that would make poets weep with recognition. He's found something worth having, and he's not about to let political calculations or social conventions deprive him of it. When the criticism reaches a crescendo, he responds by granting Lola the title Countess of Landsfeld, elevating her to a status that makes marriage theoretically possible, while simultaneously infuriating everyone who opposes the relationship. The transformation of Lola into a countess reads like political theatre at its most dramatic. She acquires not just a title, but all the trappings that go with it: estates, income, the sort of official recognition that forces society to acknowledge her existence, even if they refuse to approve of it. The ceremony of ennoblement unfolds with all the pomp Ludwig can devise, but underneath the pageantry runs a current of defiance that gives weight to what might otherwise feel like mere gesture. The student riots that follow represent something unprecedented in Bavaria's recent history: young people taking to the streets, not about economic conditions or political representation, but about the personal choices of their monarch. The university's empty as students march through Munich's narrow streets, their chants echoing off medieval walls, their torches throwing wild shadows that make the entire city seem to flicker like a candle in wind. The demonstrators aren't motivated by abstract principle but by the sort of visceral outrage that comes when cherished beliefs are challenged. They see Ludwig's relationship with Lola as a betrayal of everything they've been taught about royal dignity, about the proper order of society, about the difference between those born to rule and those born to serve. Their anger has the quality of religious fervor, the sort of passionate certainty that makes compromise impossible. Ludwig's response reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of absolute monarchy, the tension between personal desire and public responsibility, between the man and the crown he wears. He could crush the riots through force, could use the army to restore order and punish the rebels. But doing so would require becoming the sort of ruler he's never wanted to be, would transform him from benevolent patron of the arts into mere autocrat. The abdication, when it comes in 1848, unfolds with the sort of dignity that transforms political defeat into something approaching tragic grandeur. Ludwig steps down not because he's been forced to, but because he understands that remaining would require choices he's not willing to make. He chooses love over power, personal happiness over royal duty, the sort of romantic gesture that makes him a figure of legend even as it ends his political career. For Lola, Ludwig's abdication represents both triumph and catastrophe. Triumph because it proves the depth of his devotion, catastrophe because it removes the very foundation on which their relationship was built. A deposed king is just a man, and men, she's learned, are considerably less interesting than monarchs. The power that made Ludwig attractive was never really his own, but belonged to the crown, and without the crown, he becomes merely another wealthy exile with romantic delusions. The years that follow read like an extended epilogue to what might have been a different sort of story. Lola travels to America, where she reinvents herself once again, this time as a lecturer on morals and the proper conduct of life. The irony isn't lost on anyone, least of all herself. The woman who destroyed a king through scandal now makes her living telling other women how to avoid her mistakes. Her American lectures draw crowds that come partly for education and partly for entertainment, eager to hear the notorious Lola Montez explain how virtue leads to happiness and vice to ruin. She performs this role with the same theatrical skill she once brought to seducing monarchs, understanding that Americans love nothing more than a reformed sinner who can tell cautionary tales with authority. But the real legacy of Lola Montez isn't found in the political chaos she created or the moral lessons she eventually preached. It's in the questions her story raises about the relationship between passion and prudence, between personal desire and public responsibility, between the freedom to choose and the wisdom to choose well. Her life becomes a meditation on the costs of following your heart when your heart leads you into territories that society has marked as forbidden. The nighttime lesson her story teaches whispers through the centuries like wind through empty palaces. That passion unchecked by prudence can be as destructive as prudence unchecked by passion, that the greatest victories sometimes come disguised as defeats, and that the most important thing you can learn about power is when not to use it. In a world that often confuses strength with stubbornness, spectacle with substance, Lola Montez reminds us that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is walk away from everything you think you want. Her story echoes still in the cultural memory of Bavaria, a reminder that love and politics make dangerous companions, that the heart's desires and the state's needs don't always align, and that sometimes the most lasting impact comes not from what you achieve, but from what you're willing to sacrifice for the chance to achieve it. Across the English Channel, in the fashionable salons of Paris where secrets are traded like currency and scandals are cultivated like rare orchids, another story was brewing that would make Lola's adventures seem almost innocent by comparison. A French courtesan was about to discover that some love affairs are too dangerous to survive, that some secrets are too valuable to remain buried, and that sometimes the most powerful men in the world are the most vulnerable to the oldest forms of blackmail. The Parisian courtesan trial. Paris in 1917 wears its wartime face like expensive makeup applied over exhaustion, all bright surfaces hiding the deeper weariness that comes from years of grinding conflict. The Ritz Hotel still glitters in the evening light, its windows casting golden rectangles onto streets where fashionable women still promenade, despite the distant rumble of artillery, where the business of civilization continues with the sort of determined gaiety that refuses to acknowledge how close the world has come to ending. In one of the hotel's most luxurious suites, furnished with the sort of understated elegance that whispers rather than shouts about wealth, a young man in British military uniform sits across from a woman whose beauty has become legendary throughout Europe's demimonde. The Prince of Wales, he won't become Edward VIII for another decade, carries himself with the sort of careful charm that comes from understanding that everything he says and does will be scrutinized for political implications. The woman facing him needs no introduction to anyone familiar with Paris's more sophisticated entertainments. Marguerite Alibert, known to her admirers as Maggie Meller, has spent the last several years establishing herself as one of the city's premier courtesans, a woman whose clientele reads like a who's who of European power and influence. She possesses the sort of intelligence that makes conversation as seductive as physical beauty, the kind of wit that turns every exchange into a form of sophisticated flirtation. Their relationship begins in the way such relationships often do in wartime, with the heightened intensity that comes from understanding that tomorrow is never guaranteed. That pleasure taken today might be the last pleasure available. The prince, on leave from military duties that keep him safely away from actual combat, finds in Marguerite something he can't locate in the rarefied circles of his usual social world: genuine spontaneity, conversation that doesn't calculate political implications, the sort of unguarded companionship that makes him remember who he might have been if he hadn't been born to wear a crown. For Marguerite, this liaison represents something more complex than mere professional advancement. The prince offers not just wealth, though he's generous with gifts that include jewelry worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, but access to a world she's only glimpsed from the margins. Their conversations reveal a man struggling with the weight of expectations he never chose, trapped between personal desires and public duty in ways that make her own complicated position seem almost simple by comparison. The affair unfolds against the backdrop of a war that's reshaping the entire social order of Europe, making old rules seem irrelevant and new possibilities seem achievable. In their private moments, removed from the pressures of protocol and the demands of their respective roles, they create a small island of intimacy where neither crown nor reputation matters as much as the simple pleasure of being understood by another human being. The letters they exchange during the periods when duty separates them read like masterpieces of romantic correspondence, though they're also documents that will eventually prove far more dangerous than either writer imagines. The prince writes with the sort of unguarded honesty that comes from believing his words will never be seen by unfriendly eyes, revealing not state secrets but something potentially more damaging: his genuine feelings, his private doubts, his very human vulnerabilities. Marguerite's responses demonstrate the sophisticated intelligence that made her successful in a profession where beauty alone isn't enough to sustain a career. She writes about books and music and art, about the way war has changed the rhythms of city life, about the curious fact that some of life's most intense pleasures come wrapped in the certainty of their own impermanence. Her letters reveal a woman who understands that she's living through history, that the world she knows is disappearing even as she writes about it. But letters, as both correspondents will eventually learn, have a way of outliving the relationships that create them, of becoming evidence in trials their writers never imagined they'd face. When their affair ends, not dramatically, but with the sort of gentle fade-out that characterizes most wartime romances, the letters remain, tucked away in a safe deposit box, like unexploded ordnance, waiting for the right moment to detonate. The detonation comes in 1923, triggered not by political scandal but by murder most mundane. Marguerite, now married to an Egyptian playboy named Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, shoots her husband in their suite at the Savoy Hotel in London, claiming self-defense against his alleged attempts to assault her. The case that follows becomes one of the most sensational trials of the decade, not because of the crime itself, but because of what emerges during the proceedings. The murder trial unfolds like a particularly lurid piece of theatre, with Marguerite cast alternately as victimized wife and calculating killer, depending on which lawyer is speaking. The prosecution paints her as a gold digger who married for money and murdered for freedom, while the defense portrays her as a woman driven to desperate measures by an abusive husband whose violence knew no bounds. Both versions contain elements of truth, though neither captures the full complexity of a woman who defies easy categorization. But the real drama takes place not in the courtroom, but in the private negotiations that surround the trial, the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that determines which evidence will be presented and which will remain sealed forever. The letters between Marguerite and the Prince of Wales represent a form of dynamite that could destroy not just individual reputations, but the monarchy itself, and their existence transforms a simple murder case into a matter of national security. The acquittal, when it comes, surprises no one who's been following the case closely. British juries in the 1920s aren't inclined to convict attractive women who claim they were defending themselves against foreign husbands, especially when those women are defended by the sort of legal talent that money can buy. But the real victory isn't Marguerite's freedom. It's the fact that certain letters never make their way into evidence, never become part of the public record, never explode into the scandal that could have reshaped British history. The hush money that changes hands during this period remains a matter of speculation rather than documented fact. But the patterns suggest a sophisticated operation designed to protect interests much larger than Marguerite's personal freedom. The letters disappear into vaults where state secrets go to die, sealed away with the sort of official discretion that makes them more valuable than if they'd been made public immediately. The precedent established by this affair, the idea that royal indiscretions require institutional protection, that some secrets are too dangerous to reveal even in court proceedings, will echo through British history for decades. The protocols developed to handle the Marguerite Alibert situation become the template for managing subsequent royal scandals, creating a system of damage control that operates like a shadow government dedicated to protecting the monarchy from itself. But perhaps the most significant impact of this affair isn't political but personal, shaping the Prince of Wales in ways that won't become apparent until the abdication crisis of 1936. The experience of having his private letters used as leverage, of discovering that even his most intimate moments can become weapons in other people's hands, creates a paranoia about exposure that will influence every subsequent relationship he forms. The secrecy protocols that emerge from this crisis establish patterns that will define how the British establishment handles inconvenient truths for generations. The machinery of cover-up becomes so sophisticated that it operates almost automatically, creating a system where scandals are managed rather than prevented, where damage control becomes more important than damage prevention. Marguerite herself vanishes into the sort of comfortable obscurity that money can buy, her notoriety transformed into a pension that allows her to live quietly in France, far from the headlines that once made her name synonymous with scandal. She becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of loving too ambitiously, of keeping letters that should have been burned, of believing that affection offers any protection against the machinery of state power. Her story whispers through the decades like champagne bubbles rising through crystal, a reminder that some love affairs are too dangerous to survive, that some secrets are worth more than the people who know them, and that sometimes the most important thing history teaches us is how little of it ever becomes public knowledge. In a world where information is power and privacy is a luxury that few can afford, Marguerite Alibert reminds us that the most dangerous thing you can possess is evidence of other people's humanity. The letters that survived or didn't survive her trial become ghost documents in the official record, present only in their absence. their influence measured not by what they revealed, but by what they kept hidden. They represent a new kind of historical artifact, the secret that shapes events precisely because it remains secret, the document that changes history by never being read. Across the centuries and across the Channel, in the London of an earlier age where oranges were exotic luxuries and the theatre was both entertainment and battlefield, another actress was about to discover that royal affection comes with its own unique set of rewards and punishments, that being loved by a king is both the greatest fortune and the most dangerous curse a woman can experience. The Orange Cellar of Whitehall, London in the 1660s, breathes with the rhythm of a city reborn, shaking off the grim Puritan years like a dog emerging from cold water. The theatres have reopened their doors, music fills the streets again, and Charles II sits on a throne that still feels slightly miraculous after the long years of Republican experiment. The air itself seems different now, lighter somehow, charged with the sort of possibility that comes when an entire civilization decides to remember how to smile. In the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane, where the smell of oranges mingles with sawdust and the sharp scent of tallow candles, the evening's performance has drawn the usual mixture of aristocrats and merchants, courtiers and citizens, all packed together in a space that democratizes entertainment, even while maintaining the careful hierarchies that govern everything else in Restoration society. The pit buzzes with conversation, the galleries echo with laughter, and somewhere in the Orange Girl's corner, magic is about to happen. Nell Gwyn moves through the crowd with the sort of confidence that comes from understanding that survival depends on quick wit and quicker feet. At 15, she's already mastered the complex art of selling fruit to an audience that's come for theatre, of making each orange seem like a small gift rather than a simple transaction. Her voice carries over the general hubbub, not loud exactly, but pitched in a way that draws attention, that makes men look up from their programs, and women glance over with expressions that mix amusement and mild disapproval. She's the sort of girl who would have been invisible in any other age, born into the kind of poverty that makes childhood a luxury few can afford. Her mother runs a bawdy house in Coal Yard Alley. Her father is a memory that may never have been entirely real. And her education consists of whatever she's managed to pick up in the streets and theatres that have become her world. But Nell possesses something that can't be taught or bought, a natural wit that turns every exchange into a small performance, a charm that makes hardened theatregoers smile despite themselves. When she's not selling oranges, Nell haunts the edges of the theatrical world, watching rehearsals from the shadows, learning the rhythms of comedy and tragedy by absorption rather than instruction. She has a gift for mimicry that borders on the supernatural, an ability to capture not just the words, but the essence of what she sees, to transform observation into art, through some alchemy of talent and desperation. The transition from orange seller to actress happens gradually, then all at once, like dawn breaking over the Thames. One evening, when one of the regular performers falls ill, Nell steps forward with the sort of casual audacity that either gets you thrown out of the theatre or launches a career. Her performance, part improvisation, part instinct, part pure theatrical magic, brings down the house in ways that scripted entertainment rarely achieves. Thomas Killigrew, the theatre manager, who's seen everything the Restoration stage has to offer, recognizes immediately that he's discovered something unprecedented. Nell doesn't just act. She illuminates whatever role she inhabits, bringing to it a combination of natural intelligence and street-smart authenticity that makes even the most artificial dialogue feel real. When she speaks the playwright's words, they sound like thoughts she's just had rather than lines she's memorized. The roles that follow showcase a range that surprises everyone, including Nell herself. She excels at comedy, certainly. Her timing is impeccable, her ability to find humor in the darkest situations almost supernatural. but she also brings unexpected depth to dramatic roles, a quality of emotional honesty that makes audiences forget they're watching a performance. When Nell cries on stage, strong men in the audience find themselves wiping their eyes. When she laughs, the entire theater seems to brighten. It's during one of these performances that she first catches the attention of the man who will reshape her destiny. Charles II sits in the royal box, officially watching the play but actually studying the young actress who seems to glow with an inner light that has nothing to do with the footlights. The king has seen many beautiful women, has been entertained by actresses whose technical skill far exceeds Nell's. But there's something about this girl that bypasses aesthetic appreciation and speaks directly to something deeper. The meeting that follows takes place not in some palace antechamber, but in the theater itself, after a performance that has left the audience calling for encores. Charles approaches with the sort of informal courtesy that characterizes his reign, treating Nell not as a subject seeking royal favor, but as an artist whose work he's genuinely admired. Their conversation flows with surprising ease, revealing that beneath the obvious differences in station and education lies a shared appreciation for wit, for honesty, for the sort of direct communication that cuts through the elaborate protocols of court life. For Nell, this encounter represents something more complex than a simple opportunity for advancement. Charles offers not just wealth and status but genuine companionship, the sort of relationship where intelligence matters as much as beauty, where laughter is valued as highly as reverence. When he speaks to her about the weight of kingship, about the loneliness that comes with absolute power, she responds not with the calculated sympathy of a courtier, but with the sort of practical wisdom that comes from understanding what it means to be responsible for other people's welfare. The relationship that develops exists in that curious space between public knowledge and private reality, where everyone knows what's happening but no one speaks of it directly. Nell becomes the king's companion in ways that go far beyond the usual arrangements between monarchs and their mistresses. She serves as confidant, advisor, and comic relief, the person who can make Charles laugh when the business of ruling threatens to crush his spirit entirely. The house in Pall Mall that Charles provides for her becomes something unprecedented in the geography of royal London. Not quite a palace, not quite a private residence, but a space where the usual rules of court etiquette give way to something approaching domestic normalcy. Nell furnishes it with a mixture of royal gifts and her own theatrical instincts, creating an environment that's both luxurious and comfortable, where the king can sit in his shirt sleeves and remember what it feels like to be a man rather than a monarch. Their children, Charles, created Duke of St. Albans, and James, who dies young, grow up in this atmosphere of affectionate informality, learning to see their father not as the distant figure of state portraits, but as someone who tells bedtime stories and laughs at their mother's jokes. The family portrait that emerges from contemporary accounts shows something unprecedented in royal history: genuine domestic happiness existing alongside the formal requirements of kingship. But the promised marriage that never materializes hangs over their relationship like storm clouds over a summer picnic. Charles loves Nell genuinely, treats her with consistent kindness, provides for her generously, but he cannot give her the one thing that would transform their liaison from royal mistressship into something resembling conventional respectability. The crown that makes him powerful enough to protect her also makes him too important to marry her, creating a paradox that no amount of affection can resolve. The political pressures that prevent their marriage aren't personal but institutional, reflecting the complex web of alliances and obligations that keep the restored monarchy stable. Charles's official marriage to Catherine of Braganza serves diplomatic purposes that Nell's charms, however considerable, cannot fulfill. The Portuguese princess brings a dowry and strategic alliances. The English actress offers only love, which is simultaneously everything and nothing in the calculations of statecraft. Nell navigates these limitations with the sort of grace that comes from understanding that some battles can't be won through fighting. She doesn't rage against the constraints that keep her from becoming queen. doesn't demand recognition that the system cannot provide. Instead, she creates her own form of royalty, becoming the unofficial queen of London's theatrical world, the woman whose approval matters more than court protocol. The charitable work that characterizes her later years reveals depths that surprise those who see her only as the king's witty companion. The pension fund she establishes for retired actors, the support she provides for struggling playwrights, the informal network of assistants she creates for women trying to make lives for themselves in the theatre. These activities demonstrate a generosity of spirit that goes far beyond mere noblesse oblige. When Charles dies in 1685, his deathbed request, "Don't let poor Nellie starve," becomes one of the most famous last words in English history, a phrase that captures both the genuine affection of their relationship and the precarious nature of her position. The new king, James II, honors his brother's wishes with the sort of grudging duty that makes charity feel like punishment. But Nell survives the transition with her dignity intact. The legacy she leaves behind transcends the usual categories of royal mistress or theatrical celebrity. Nell Gwyn becomes something unprecedented in English cultural history, a woman who achieved lasting fame not through noble birth or political intrigue, but through the force of her personality, the quality of her wit, and her ability to make one of England's most powerful kings remember what it felt like to be human. The Chelsea Hospital for Retired Soldiers, established partly through Nell's influence and partly through Charles's genuine concern for military veterans, stands as a permanent monument to their partnership. The pensioners who still pace its courtyards carry forward a tradition that began with conversations between a king and an actress, between power and wit, between the formal requirements of state and the informal demands of the heart. Her story whispers through the centuries like applause echoing in empty theatres, a reminder that some forms of immortality have nothing to do with noble birth or official recognition, that the most lasting influence often comes from those who make others laugh, who offer comfort without expectation of reward, who understand that the greatest gift you can give to power is the reminder that it's exercised by human beings who sometimes need to remember their own humanity. The Thames still flows past the sites where Nell walked, where she lived and loved and laughed her way into legend. The theatres have changed, the oranges are sold by different voices, but something of her spirit lingers in the London air, the sense that wit and warmth can triumph over circumstance, that love expressed honestly is its own form of nobility, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a king is help him remember how to smile. Far to the east, in lands where the Yellow River winds through plains that have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties beyond counting, another story was unfolding in the perfumed gardens of the Tang Court. A woman whose beauty would inspire poets for 1,000 years was about to discover that being loved by an emperor can be both the greatest blessing and the most terrible curse that fate can bestow upon a mortal soul. The fragrant consort, Chang'an, in the summer of 745 shimmers like a mirage made manifest, the greatest city in the world spreading along the Wei River, like a jewel box opened under heaven's vault. The Tang capital breathes with the rhythm of an empire at its zenith, where Persian merchants trade alongside Korean scholars, where Buddhist monasteries rise next to Taoist temples, where the very air seems perfumed with the accumulated wealth of half the known world. In the imperial gardens, jasmine blooms in patterns that took generations of gardeners to perfect, their fragrance drifting on breezes that carry the sound of distant music from the palace beyond. In the Huaqing hot springs, where emperors have come for centuries to escape the weight of governing the Middle Kingdom, the water steams in natural pools carved from living rock, each basin reflecting the surrounding mountains like mirrors set in jade. Here, in this sanctuary removed from the formal protocols of court life, Emperor Xuanzong seeks the sort of peace that has become increasingly elusive as his reign stretches into its 4th decade. At 61, The emperor has achieved everything the mandate of heaven could offer. Military victories that expanded the borders beyond their historical limits. Cultural flowering that makes his court the envy of neighboring kingdoms. Economic prosperity that has transformed Chang'an into a magnet for artists and philosophers from across the civilized world. But success, he's discovering, isn't the same thing as satisfaction, and power, however absolute, cannot fill the emptiness that has settled into his heart like winter mist. It's during one of these retreats to the hot springs that fate arranges his meeting with Yang Yuhuan. Though she won't become Yang Guifei, the precious consort, until circumstances transform a chance encounter into an obsession that will reshape an empire. She moves through the gardens like poetry written in silk, tending the flowering trees with the sort of attention that suggests she sees beauty not as decoration, but as a form of prayer made visible. Yang Yuhuan has spent the last several years in the curious liminal space occupied by women who serve the imperial family without quite belonging to it. As a Taoist nun in the palace complex, she's achieved a form of independence that most women of her era can only dream of, free from the usual expectations of marriage and motherhood, but also isolated from the ordinary pleasures of domestic life. Her days are filled with meditation and study, with the cultivation of arts that transform ordinary moments into something approaching transcendence. When the emperor first notices her among the garden attendants, what strikes him isn't her beauty, though she possesses the sort of loveliness that makes poets struggle for adequate metaphors, but the quality of attention she brings to whatever task occupies her hands. Whether she's arranging flowers or copying sutras or simply walking among the jasmine beds, she moves with a consciousness that makes everything around her seem more vivid, more worthy of notice. Their first conversation takes place beside a pool where lotus blossoms float like prayers made visible, their pink and white petals creating patterns that shift with each breath of wind. Xuanzong speaks to her about the garden, about the way different seasons reveal different aspects of the same unchanging beauty, and discovers that she responds not with the calculated deference he expects from palace servants, but with genuine understanding, with observations that reveal a mind capable of finding profound meaning in simple phenomena. For Yang Yuhuan, this encounter represents something she didn't realize she'd been missing during her years of contemplative isolation. The emperor speaks to her not as a superior addressing a subordinate, but as one human being sharing wonder with another, and his attention has the quality of someone who's genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than merely impressed by her appearance. When he asks about her understanding of Taoist philosophy, she responds with insights that surprise them both. The relationship that develops unfolds like a particularly complex piece of music, full of themes and variations that seem to approach resolution only to spiral away into new harmonies. Xuanzong begins visiting the gardens more frequently, ostensibly to check on the seasonal arrangements, but actually to engage Yang Yuhuan in conversations that range from the practical to the metaphysical, from the proper care of flowering trees to the nature of beauty itself. The transformation from Taoist nun to imperial consort happens gradually, then all at once, like seasons changing in the mountains. First comes the formal adoption into the imperial family, a legal fiction that makes romantic attachment theoretically possible. Then the elevation to consort status, with all the honors and responsibilities that implies. Finally, the marriage ceremony itself, conducted with the sort of elaborate pageantry that turns personal affection into state theater. Yang Guifei, for that's her title now, the precious consort who outranks even the empress in the emperor's affection, brings to her new position a combination of artistic, sophistication, and spiritual depth that transforms the imperial court from a center of political power into something approaching a Renaissance salon. Under her influence, the palace becomes a place where poetry and music matter as much as military strategy, where aesthetic judgment carries the same weight as administrative competence. The cultural flowering that follows reads like a catalogue of artistic achievement. The court musicians, inspired by Yang Guifei's own considerable musical talents, develop new forms that blend traditional Chinese melodies with influences from across the Silk Road. The orchestras that perform for imperial entertainments grow to include 300 musicians, creating soundscapes of such complexity and beauty that visitors from distant kingdoms weep at their magnificence. The poetry that emerges from this period captures something unprecedented in Chinese literature, the synthesis of political power and personal passion. The way love can illuminate statecraft, and statecraft can provide the canvas for love. Li Bai and Du Fu, the greatest poets of the Tang dynasty, find in the emperor's devotion to Yang Guifei a theme that allows them to explore the relationship between earthly beauty and celestial harmony, between the pleasures of the senses and the longings of the soul. But the extravagance that characterizes Xuanzong's devotion begins to create problems that no amount of artistic achievement can solve. The emperor's attention, once distributed across the vast apparatus of imperial administration, focuses like sunlight through a lens, creating a brilliant center that illuminates everything around Yang Guifei, while leaving other areas of government in shadow. Military preparations lag, provincial administration suffers, and the careful balance of interests that keeps the empire stable begins to shift in dangerous directions. The Yang clan's rise to prominence follows the inevitable logic of imperial favor, but their elevation creates resentments that spread through the court like cracks in a foundation. Yang Guifei's relatives receive appointments and honors that previous generations had to earn through merit or birth, creating a new aristocracy based not on service or bloodline, but on their connection to the emperor's beloved. The most prominent among them, Yang Guozhong, becomes chief minister, despite having no particular qualifications for high office beyond his relationship to the woman who's captured the emperor's heart. The An-Lushan rebellion, when it erupts in 755, catches the empire unprepared precisely because the emperor's attention has been focused on private happiness rather than public security. An-Lushan, the general whose loyalty seemed unquestionable, reveals that discontent has been growing in the military ranks while the court was distracted by poetry and music. His armies marched toward Chang'an with frightening speed, forcing the imperial family to flee the capital in circumstances that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The flight to Mawei Station unfolds like a nightmare in slow motion, with the emperor and his court reduced to refugees fleeing through their own territory, dependent on the loyalty of guards who've begun to question whether following their emperor means marching towards safety or disaster. The summer heat makes travel brutal. The roads are clogged with other refugees, and the news that reaches them suggests that the rebellion is spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible. At Mawei, the imperial guards make their position clear with the sort of direct communication that armies use when diplomatic language fails. They will go no further, while Yang Guifei remains alive, will not risk their lives protecting a woman whose influence they blame for the empire's current chaos. The demand isn't negotiable, isn't subject to imperial decree or emotional appeal. It's the sort of ultimatum that reduces absolute power to powerless choice. The execution that follows becomes one of the most tragic scenes in Chinese history, a moment when personal love and political necessity collide with such force that both are destroyed in the impact. Yang Guifei accepts her fate with the sort of dignity that comes from understanding that some sacrifices are required, not because they're deserved, but because they're necessary. That love sometimes demands the ultimate gift precisely because it is love, rather than mere affection. The aftermath of her death haunts Xuanzong for the remaining years of his reign, transforming him from a confident ruler into a melancholy figure who governs competently but without joy, who performs his duties while mourning what those duties have cost him. The palace that once rang with music becomes a place of perpetual sorrow, where every garden reminds him of conversations that will never be repeated, where every sunset recalls the beauty that no longer watches it with him. The poetry that emerges from this tragedy achieves a kind of immortality that political success never could have granted. Li Bai's verses about Yang Guifei's beauty, Du Fu's elegies for the golden age that ended with her death, and countless anonymous songs that preserve her memory in folk tradition. These works ensure that the precious consort lives on in Chinese cultural memory long after the political circumstances that destroyed her have been forgotten. The legend of Yang Guifei that develops over the centuries transforms her from historical figure into symbol, representing the eternal tension between love and duty, between personal happiness and public responsibility, between the desires of the heart and the demands of power. In opera and painting, in poetry and popular song, she becomes the embodiment of beauty that inspires and destroys in equal measure, the woman whose love was both gift and curse. The Huaqing hot springs still steam in their mountain setting, still reflect the changing seasons in their clear waters. Visitors come to walk in the gardens where Yang Guifei once tended jasmine, to imagine the conversations that once filled these spaces with laughter and music. The perfume that gave her one of her many names, the fragrant consort, seems to linger still in the evening air, a reminder that some forms of beauty transcend their own destruction, that some loves achieve immortality precisely because they cannot be sustained in the world of ordinary time. Her story whispers through the centuries like incense smoke rising toward heaven, a meditation on the price of perfection, the cost of absolute beauty, and the curious fact that the greatest love stories often end not with triumph, but with sacrifice, not with possession, but with loss, not with the fulfillment of desire, but with the understanding that some desires are too precious for this world to contain. The legend of ANARKALI, Lahore in the twilight of the 16th century, breathes with the rhythm of an empire at its most confident zenith, where the Mughal court spreads across the Punjab like a constellation of gardens and palaces, each one designed to demonstrate that paradise might indeed be achieved through the proper application of imperial will and aesthetic vision. The bazaars hum with the languages of a dozen kingdoms. Persian poetry mingles with Hindi songs in the evening air, and somewhere in the narrow streets that wind away from the fort like rivers seeking the sea, magic masquerades as entertainment in the form of a dancing girl whose very name will become legend. The courtesan known as ANARKALI, though whether that was her birth name or simply another layer in the elaborate fiction that surrounded her professional existence, remains one of history's smaller mysteries, moves through the cultural landscape of Mughal Lahore like music made visible. In the Kotha, where she performs, oil lamps cast dancing shadows against walls, hung with silk from distant provinces, while the air grows thick with rosewater and the sort of anticipation that precedes transcendent art. Her performance tonight includes the lamp dance that will become her signature, a feat of balance and grace that seems to defy the fundamental laws governing the relationship between human bodies and gravity. With a burning oil lamp balanced on her head, she moves through complex choreography that tells stories of divine love and earthly passion, her feet marking rhythms that seem to emerge from the heartbeat of the city itself, her hands tracing patterns in the air that capture and release meaning like butterflies, too beautiful to hold. But ANARKALI, and here we must pause to acknowledge that even her name, pomegranate blossom, might be an invention designed to create exactly the sort of poetic resonance that legends require, is more than a dancer. She's an artist in the truest sense, someone who understands that entertainment at its highest level becomes a form of philosophy, that the movements of the human body can express truths that resist capture in any other medium. The historical record grows frustratingly thin when we try to trace the actual details of her life, as if the very power of her legend has consumed the mundane facts that might once have anchored her to ordinary reality. What we know with certainty is this: she performed in Lahore during the reign of Akbar the Great. She was renowned for her beauty and artistic skill, and she became entangled in a love affair that would reshape Mughal succession politics in ways that echo through the centuries. Prince Salim, who will become the Emperor Jahangir when his father finally relinquishes power, discovers ANARKALI during one of his visits to Lahore's entertainment districts, those carefully regulated spaces where the Mughal elite come to experience art forms that wouldn't be permitted in the more formal settings of court culture. The prince, already showing signs of the aesthetic sensibility that will characterize his later reign, recognizes immediately that he's witnessing something unprecedented. The attraction that develops between them transcends the usual categories of royal patron and court entertainer, moving into territory that makes everyone around them nervous precisely because it seems so genuine, so uncalculated, so dangerous to the careful balance of power that keeps the empire stable. When Salim looks at ANARKALI, he doesn't see a dancing girl displaying her skills for royal approval. He sees a woman whose artistry represents everything he admires about human creativity, whose presence makes him remember what it feels like to be moved by beauty, rather than merely entertained by it. For her part, ANARKALI navigates this attention with the skill of someone who's learned that survival in the Mughal court requires understanding the difference between genuine feeling and mere imperial caprice. But there's something in Salim's manner that suggests depth rather than shallow infatuation, a quality of attention that makes her feel valued not just for her beauty or her talent, but for the person those gifts express. The relationship that develops exists in the shadowland between public knowledge and private reality, where everyone understands what's happening, but no one speaks of it directly. Their meetings take place in gardens where fountains provide acoustic cover for conversations that could reshape an empire, in pavilions where silk curtains create temporary privacy from the eyes that follow every movement of potential emperors. But secrets, particularly secrets involving imperial succession, have a way of becoming public precisely when such revelation can cause maximum damage. When Akbar discovers his son's involvement with the dancing girl, and the discovery might have been accidental, or it might have been orchestrated by courtiers who understood that royal scandals could be weapons in the right hands, his reaction is swift and decisive, characterized by the sort of imperial rage that makes mountains seem unstable. The confrontation between father and son that follows becomes one of those historical moments where personal drama and political necessity collide with such force that both are transformed in the impact. Akbar sees in Salim's infatuation a threat not just to dynastic dignity, but to the carefully constructed system of alliances and obligations that keeps the Mughal Empire stable. A future emperor who can be distracted by a dancing girl is a future emperor who might make other decisions based on emotion rather than statecraft. Salim's response reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of absolute monarchy, the tension between personal desire and imperial duty, between the man and the crown he's destined to wear. He could renounce ANARKALI, could submit to his father's will and preserve his position in the succession. But love, particularly love that feels like recognition of one's truest self, doesn't yield easily to political calculation. The punishment that Akbar devises for this defiance belongs more to legend than to documented history, though that may be precisely the point. According to the stories that have crystallized around this affair, ANARKALI is condemned to be buried alive, walled up in a tomb while still breathing, left to die in darkness as punishment for the presumption of loving above her station. The sentence is carried out, the legend tells us, in full view of the court, a demonstration of what happens when personal desire challenges imperial authority. But here the historical record fractures into competing narratives, each one shaped by the political needs and aesthetic preferences of whoever was telling the story. Some accounts suggest that ANARKALI was secretly rescued, spirited away, to live quietly in some distant province, where she could dance for village audiences who appreciated her art without understanding its political implications. Others claim that she died as the legend describes, becoming a martyr to the impossible love that occasionally erupts between people who belong to different worlds. The tomb that still stands in Lahore, or claims to stand, since archaeological investigation has raised more questions than it's answered, bears an inscription attributed to ANARKALI herself. "Ah, could I behold the face of my beloved once more, I would thank God until the day of resurrection." Whether these words were actually carved by the historical ANARKALI or added later by someone who understood what legends require matters less than their emotional accuracy, their perfect capture of the longing that transforms ordinary love into something approaching the mythic. The historical Jahangir, when he finally becomes emperor, proves to be exactly the sort of aesthetically sensitive ruler that his youthful infatuation with a dancing girl might have predicted. His court becomes famous for its patronage of art and literature, its tolerance for cultural diversity, its understanding that empire is about more than military conquest and administrative efficiency. Whether his artistic sensibility was shaped by his early exposure to ANARKALI's performances, or whether the same temperament that made him appreciate her art also made him a patron of culture, is a question that historians debate while poets assume the connection. But the real legacy of the ANARKALI legend isn't found in questions of historical accuracy or imperial policy. It's in the way her story has shaped South Asian popular culture for 4 centuries, becoming a template for understanding how love operates across boundaries of class and power, how art can be both sanctuary and trap, how beauty can inspire and destroy in equal measure. The radio dramas that still broadcast her story on midnight programs understand something that academic historians sometimes miss, that the power of the ANARKALI legend lies not in its factual accuracy, but in its emotional truth, its perfect expression of the longing that makes people risk everything for love, its capture of the tragedy that occurs when personal desire collides with institutional power. The films that retell her story, from the early days of Indian cinema to contemporary Bollywood productions, each find new ways to explore the eternal themes her legend embodies. The details change with each telling, but the essential elements remain constant. The dancing girl whose beauty transcends her circumstances, the prince who risks everything for love, the emperor whose duty requires him to destroy what he might privately admire, the tomb that becomes a monument to the impossibility of love across impossible boundaries. The ANARKALI Bazaar, in modern Lahore, named for the courtesan whose story refuses to die, buzzes with commercial activity that would probably amuse the woman whose memory it honors. Vendors sell everything from silk scarves to electronic gadgets, while tourists search for some tangible connection to a story that exists primarily in the realm of imagination. The irony isn't lost on anyone who understands how legends work. The woman who may never have existed now gives her name to one of Pakistan's most famous markets, proving that fictional truth can be more powerful than factual reality. Her story whispers through the centuries like tabla rhythms heard through palace walls, a reminder that some love affairs are too perfect for this world to contain, that some forms of beauty are too dangerous to survive contact with power, and that sometimes the most important thing history preserves isn't what actually happened, but what people needed to believe could happen, even if such belief came wrapped in tragedy. The lamp that ANARKALI balanced on her head during her performances has become a metaphor that poets still employ when they want to describe the precarious nature of love, the way passion requires perfect balance to avoid destruction, the curious fact that the most beautiful things are often the most fragile. In a world where love and power rarely coexist peacefully, her legend offers the consolation that some loves are too pure to be destroyed by the circumstances that end them, too perfect to be diminished by the tragedy that claims them. And now, as our journey through these stories of hearts that refuse to know their place draws toward its close, we must step back from the particular to consider the general. From the individual loves that challenged empires, to the patterns those challenges reveal about the eternal tension between personal desire and public duty, between the human heart and the machinery of power, patterns of scandal, reform, If we were to spread these stories across a map of both space and time, what emerges is a curious pattern of repetition and variation, like a musical theme played in different keys by orchestras separated by centuries and continents. From the candlelit streets of 6th century Constantinople to the electric lights of 20th century Paris, from the jasmine gardens of Tang China to the orange-scented theatres of Restoration London, the same fundamental drama keeps unfolding. Love ignores boundaries that power has carefully constructed, and power responds with the sort of institutional panic that reveals how fragile those boundaries actually are. The common threads that run through these stories read like a sociologist's field notes on the intersection of class, gender, and political authority. In every case, we see the transgression of carefully maintained social hierarchies, where women born into circumstances that society has marked as permanently inferior somehow capture the attention and affection of men whose power should theoretically place them beyond such influence. The moral panic that inevitably follows suggests that these love affairs threaten more than individual reputations. They challenge the fundamental assumptions about social order that keep entire civilizations stable. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this pattern is how consistently these scandals produce lasting reforms, as if love's capacity to disrupt existing arrangements forces societies to examine and eventually improve the very systems that made such disruption necessary in the first place. The revised marriage laws that allowed Justinian to wed Theodora didn't just solve one emperor's romantic problems. They created legal precedents that expanded marriage rights for ordinary citizens throughout the Byzantine Empire. When power bends to accommodate love, the effects ripple outward in ways that benefit people who never get close to palaces. The shift in public opinion that we can trace across these centuries reveals something profound about the relationship between individual stories and collective consciousness. In Byzantium, Theodora's elevation from actress to empress required changing actual laws, suggesting that the 6th century still believed in the possibility of institutional flexibility, that legal systems could be modified to accommodate extraordinary circumstances. By the 19th century, when Lola Montez was destroying Ludwig's Bavarian monarchy, the mechanisms of change had shifted from legal reform to press freedom and public opinion, indicating that power itself had become more distributed, more dependent on popular consent. The economic subtext that runs through all these stories deserves particular attention because it reveals how thoroughly questions of love and marriage are embedded in larger systems of resource distribution and cultural patronage. The courtesans and dancing girls and actresses who captured royal attention weren't just beautiful women. They were often the primary repositories of artistic and cultural knowledge in societies that provided few other venues for such preservation. When ANARKALI danced with a lamp on her head, she wasn't just entertaining the Mughal court. She was maintaining and transmitting dance traditions that might otherwise have been lost. When Moran sang ghazals in Ranjit Singh's Durbar, she was preserving poetic forms that carried centuries of cultural memory. This suggests that the attraction these women held for powerful men wasn't just physical or even emotional, but intellectual and aesthetic. They represented forms of knowledge and artistic achievement that the formal educational systems of their time didn't provide to anyone, including rulers. In an age before universities offered comprehensive liberal arts education, before cultural institutions existed to preserve and transmit artistic traditions, the entertainment districts and performance spaces where these women worked served as informal centers of learning, places where rulers could encounter forms of human achievement that their official education had neglected. The lasting policy echoes that emerge from these love affairs reveal how personal relationships can reshape institutional structures in ways that outlast the relationships themselves. The women's property rights that Theodora championed during her time as Byzantine empress established legal precedents that protected women's inheritance claims for generations. The postal reforms that benefited dancers' families during Moran's influence in the Punjab created administrative systems that improved communication throughout the Sikh Empire. The charitable institutions that Nell Gwyn helped establish in Charles II's England provided support for military veterans and theatrical performers that continued long after both lovers had died. Even the negative reactions to these relationships produced positive changes over time. The theatre censorship that emerged from various royal scandals eventually led to more sophisticated discussions about the relationship between art and morality, between entertainment and social responsibility. The religious controversies sparked by rulers who married outside their traditional faith communities forced theological and legal scholars to develop more nuanced understandings of how divine authority intersects with human institutions. The Sikh widow protection laws that emerged partly in response to Moran's advocacy demonstrate how personal influence could translate into systemic reform. When someone with access to power understands suffering from personal experience, they often possess the motivation and insight necessary to create effective solutions. The women in these stories, precisely because they had lived outside the protection of traditional social structures, understood vulnerabilities that those born into privilege might never recognize. But perhaps the most significant pattern that emerges from these stories is how consistently they reveal the artificial nature of the social boundaries they transgress. The shock that greets each of these relationships suggests that people understood, on some level, that the barriers separating aristocrats from commoners, rulers from subjects, the powerful from the powerless, were not natural phenomena, but human constructions that could be modified or eliminated entirely. The panic these love affairs generated wasn't really about morality or tradition. It was about the fear that if these particular boundaries could be crossed, then perhaps all boundaries were more porous than they appeared. The legal systems that had to be modified to accommodate these relationships reveal their own flexibility, their capacity for adaptation when circumstances required it. Laws that seemed absolute proved to be merely conventional when someone with sufficient power decided that convention needed to change. This suggests that many of the social restrictions that people in these historical periods accepted as unchangeable were actually much more contingent than they realized, dependent on collective agreement rather than natural law. The cultural transformations that followed these royal love affairs often proved more lasting than the political changes they initially produced. The artistic patronage that emerged from rulers' relationships with performers and artists created cultural flowering that outlasted the dynasties that sponsored it. The poetry inspired by young Guifei's beauty still shapes Chinese literary tradition. The architectural innovations influenced by Anita Delgado's Spanish aesthetic still mark the landscape of Kapurthala. The theatrical traditions that Nell Gwyn helped establish still influence English drama. This suggests that when love crosses boundaries successfully, it doesn't just create temporary disruption, but permanent expansion of legal possibilities, of cultural horizons, of human understanding about what relationships can achieve when they're based on genuine recognition rather than mere calculation. The societies that initially resisted these love affairs often ended up incorporating their innovations, as if love's capacity to see beyond existing limitations provided a kind of social vision that purely political thinking couldn't match. The press freedoms that eventually emerged from efforts to manage royal scandals created communication systems that benefited entire populations. When institutions developed sophisticated methods for controlling information about sensitive relationships, they inadvertently created infrastructure that could be used to spread other kinds of information as well. The networks established to suppress inconvenient truths about royal love affairs eventually became the channels through which broader social and political reforms could be communicated and coordinated. The most profound insight that emerges from examining these stories collectively might be this: love, particularly love that crosses established boundaries, serves as a kind of social research, testing the flexibility and responsiveness of existing institutions, revealing which structures are truly necessary and which are merely conventional. When someone with power falls in love with someone without it, the relationship forces society to examine its assumptions about merit, worth, and the distribution of opportunity. The soothing summation that ties all these stories together whispers like evening prayers across the centuries. Love, like sleep, ignores titles, recognizes no passport stamps, acknowledges no customs barriers between the country of the heart and the various territories that political power creates and maintains. The boundaries that seem so important to the architects of civilization become merely inconvenient details when two people discover they see something essential in each other that the rest of the world has missed. In the end, these stories suggest that the most lasting revolutions might not be the ones that capture headlines or topple governments, but the quiet transformations that occur when individual human beings decide that their connections to each other matter more than the systems designed to keep them apart. Love's capacity to ignore social boundaries doesn't just create beautiful stories, it creates the possibility that society itself might become more beautiful, more flexible, more responsive to human needs rather than institutional convenience. The palaces where these love affairs unfolded have mostly crumbled or been transformed into museums, but the changes they produced continue to echo through legal systems, cultural traditions, and collective memory. Perhaps that's the real legacy of hearts that refused to know their place. They didn't just challenge the world as it was, they helped create the world as it could become, one impossible love story at a time.